Biafra Britain's Shame. Chapter 2. The British Rule. On October 15, 1964, the British people elected a new government, the first Labour administration for 13 years. Its majority was tiny, but there was no mistaking the sense of excitement it generated throughout Britain's entire liberal intelligentsia. This was partly, perhaps, because the country was heartily relieved to see the Conservatives go. 13 years of more or less shabby opportunism had been crowned at the end by the appointment of a Prime Minister whom history may well judge to have been the most disastrous of the preceding century, both from the point of view of his country and for his party. The only major decision which Sir Alec Douglas-Home took during his 12 months premiership was to postpone the general election until the last possible moment. This extraordinarily unscrupulous electoral manipulation obliged his Chancellor of the Esquire, Mr. Reginald Maudling, to persevere with an artificial pre-electoral economic boom for an extra 6 months and resulted in a huge deficit at the end of the year, as well as an unworkably small Labour majority. The Conservatives, of course, would have been in exactly the same position if they had happened to win, as they very nearly did, and the spectacle of a tired administration trying to clear up its own mess with an unworkably small majority might well have put paid to the Tories' chances for a very long time indeed. Within 9 months of losing the general election, Sir Alec Douglas-Home was forced to resign from leadership of the official Conservative opposition after a number of Conservative members of Parliament between 35 and 50, it is thought, had seen the party's chief whip, Mr. William Whitelaw, and demanded that he should do so. He then became chief opposition spokesman on foreign and Commonwealth affairs, in which capacity he will feature largely in the course of this narrative, since it was in very considerable part due to the absence of any effective parliamentary opposition that the British government found itself step by step implicated in the crime of genocide against an African people, destroying, in the course of it, over 1 million friendly African civilians. Before passing on, however, it is relevant to note that the act of resignation, with all its overtones of disinterestedness, a quality which has never been the major characteristics of British politicians, transformed Sir Alec Douglas-Home overnight from having been an unpopular Prime Minister and a stupefying ineffective leader of the opposition into a generally admired elder statesman. This phenomenon is probably to be explained by the secrecy which the Conservative Party traditionally maintains about its internal affairs, so that few people ever knew the exact circumstances of his resignation, and also by the fact that his successor, Mr. Edward Heath, soon proved to be even more unpopular than he had ever been. But the Labour government started with such enormous goodwill for more reason than that people were heartily glad to see the Tories go. Socialists rejoiced that state economic planning was at last to be given a try. Egalitarians that the rich were due for a little punishment, and technologists that their machinery was going to be treated with greater respect than in the past. These were the three main planks of Labour's election program. But over and above all this, even among those who felt skeptical about the advantages of state economic planning, sucking the rich or glorifying technology, there was a feeling that at last the good people were in charge. They may not have been utopian socialists, but at least they were motivated by a wish to improve society rather than simply to stay in power, by ordinary human kindliness rather than by a desire to prove their own superiority and protect their own economic interests. The new Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, caused a considerable stir by creating the new Department of Economic Affairs and putting Mr. George Brown, his Deputy Prime Minister, in charge of it. Other appointments, too, caused a stir, but few people noticed one of Mr. Wilson's least flamboyant appointments, that of Mr. Michael Stewart, to the comparatively insignificant Ministry of Education. Now, in all probability, would anyone ever have noticed him again if Mr. Patrick Gordon Walker, who was Mr. Wilson's first choice of Foreign Secretary, had not failed to be elected at Smethwick, where the Commonwealth immigration issue was a dominant factor, and again at the safe Labour seat of Leighton, where his own personal inadequacies were to blame. Mr. Wilson had to find a new Foreign Secretary at a time when all his best talents were just settling into their ministries, and the choice fell upon Mr. Michael Stewart. A slight, balding grey figure, he was a former school teacher of unremarkable middle-class background, whose chief characteristics throughout this time was that nobody noticed him. When the second Wilson government was returned in the spring of 1966 and soon afterwards started the long haul of squeeze, freeze, and economic retrenchment, it had already taken the only three major decisions it was ever voluntarily able to take. The first was not to devalue. This was abandoned in November 1967 when circumstances forced a devaluation. The second was to apply for entry into the common market. This was frustrated by the French veto. The third was to retain a military presence east of Suez. This, too, was abandoned in the face of economic necessity. In all these, and in the turmoils which shook the Wilson cabinet, Stewart's main characteristics, a kind of aloof dimness, became his greatest asset. Wilson accepted him as one senior member of the cabinet who presented no threat whatever to his personal position, and the other members of the cabinet grew to respect him as an impartial figure removed from their own bitter squabbles. Even if his judgments were often fallible, and even if he defended them with the sort of dogged obstinacy one usually associates with blind sheepdogs in children's stories. When George Brown resigned from the Department of Economic Affairs after the collapse of his national plan with the first heavy dose of deflation and chose the Foreign Office, faithful sheepdog Stewart was the obvious person to send to the Department of Economic Affairs. Later, when George Brown resigned from the government in protest at the way in which Mr. Wilson was running it, the Prime Minister's position was then too weak to appoint any, except the least spectacular of his team, into such a powerful office as that of the Foreign Secretary. So back went Mr. Stewart. In the intervening period, he had retired almost completely from view, since the Department of Economic Affairs was now more or less a sinecure, and he had distinguished himself only in the cabinet role of December 1967 over the sale of arms to South Africa, when his dogged advocacy was largely instrumental in bringing Mr. Wilson round to the view which eventually prevailed, a refusal to sell arms on moral grounds. The political climate then, when Mr. Stewart retook possession of the Foreign Office in the spring of 1968, was one of disillusion aggravated by financial stringency, with the cabinet just recovering from its bitter squabble of all over the South African arms issue. Mr. Jenkins, the Chancellor, was struggling to make a success of devaluation. Mr. Haley was still smarting from his defeat, along with George Brown, over the sale of arms to South Africa. Mr. Wilson was exceedingly nervous of another such incident. By then, the war between Nigeria and Biafra had been fought for 8 months. British policy and British influence in Lagos had always been solidly in favor of anything which looked like being able to hold the Federation together. There was nothing surprising, and there need have been nothing reprehensible about this, at any rate, among people who had neglected to follow the history of Nigeria after independence. Nigeria was Britain's proudest colonial achievement, the home of some 12,000 British subjects, easily the most populous country in Africa and potentially the most prosperous. Britain already had some £500 million invested in the Federation, and the field for future exploitation, especially the oil deposits in the East and Middle West, was almost limitless. Oil, moreover, was a particularly sensitive commodity ever since our first withdrawal from the Gulf and since Egypt had shown her apparent readiness to close the Suez Canal indefinitely. Nothing which threatened radically to change the state of affairs could be for the better, and balkanization of any sort seemed the riskiest of all. It is arguable that it was British influence which prevented General Gowon, the Nigerian military leader, from honoring the agreement reached at Aburi, Ghana in January 1967, whereby the regions agreed to remain within a loose federation, and Gowon agreed to help the 2 million refugees who had poured into the former eastern region, what is now Biafra, after the massacres of 1966. This is hotly denied in Whitehall, though there is certainly evidence to suggest that it was Sir Francis Cumming Bruce, the then High Commissioner in Lagos, who dissuaded General Gowon from announcing the breakup of the Federation in his famous broadcast of August 1, 1966. Whether the British encompassed it or not, it was the repudiation of the Aburi Agreement which made war inevitable. It left Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu as military governor of the eastern region with 2 million refugees on his hands, refugees who had been terrified into leaving their homes in the rest of Nigeria and having rejoined their families in the east, had created a climate of opinion in which no Easterner any longer felt secure within the Nigerian Federation. This feeling of insecurity was heightened by the fact that after 20 to 50,000 individual murders of Easterners which had taken place throughout Nigeria between May and October, scarcely a single person had been brought to trial by the federal government. Since many of these murders had been committed by the federal army, it seemed an inevitable conclusion to the Biafrans that they were condoned by General Gowon. After the first wave of massacres in May and June 1966, Colonel Ojukwu sent refugees back into Nigeria in a last-minute attempt to save the Federation. Then the massacres started again. After the repudiation of Aburi, which afforded the eastern region the minimum essential guarantees for its own security, and on the promulgation of General Gowon's 12-state plan, which divided the region into 3 new states more subservient than ever to Lagos, the people of the former eastern region felt they had no alternative but to secede. They gave expression to this in the Declaration of the Republic of Biafra after an unanimous vote of the Consultative Assembly of the Eastern Region, at which all the tribes and provinces were represented on May 30, 1967. Although the Eastern region had been making preparations for its own defense ever since November, with the arrival of 2 million refugees from the massacres, both London and Lagos knew this. The fact that Colonel Ojukwu still hoped to avoid war is plain from the declaration, which expressed Biafra's readiness to enter into association with Nigeria for the purpose of establishing close economic links. All this was to no avail because Nigeria invaded on July 6, 1967, capturing Bonny in the south and surrounding the university town of Nsukka in the north before Colonel, now General Ojukwu, launched his counterattack in the Midwest on August 7th. A longer account of Nigerian history up to the moment of secession has been given in the preceding chapter. Up to this moment, British policy had certainly been ill-informed and also tinged with callousness, since it assumed that the terrors of the Igbo people and others of the eastern region could be overcome by a show of force majeure, but it had not yet become in any way criminal. It was based upon a simple error of logic, and nobody had ever supposed that the Commonwealth Office commanded the finest available brain power in the land. The error started by assuming that the secessionist movement in Biafra was no more than a simple tribal pressure of the sort which has always plagued every ex-colonial African country. It pointed to similar pressures in other countries and urged, quite rightly in many cases, that tribal fragmentation in this would do nothing but harm the economic purpose of the people involved. It also pointed to the tribal diversity of Nigeria itself and argued, quite rightly, that disintegration along tribal lines would not be conducive to the general good and should therefore be discouraged. Finally, and it was this binding error of logic obstinately maintained which led to Britain's commitment to a war long after its effect could be seen to be genocidal. It was argued that if ever one such tribal pressure were to prevail in what were admittedly exceptional circumstances, then it inescapably followed that every single other such tribal pressure would be similarly successful. As a reason for urging the continued unity of Nigeria, such sloppy logic was reasonable enough. As a reason for urging a short, sharp police action, it was slightly more questionable. As a reason for supporting the continued prosecution of a war in which 14,000 people a day were known to be dying until the war's aim of one Nigeria was accomplished, such obstinate stupidity became a crime against humanity of a magnitude which no British government had ever contemplated before. Of course, the circumstances of Biafra's secession were always admitted to have been exceptional, even if one disregarded the fact that Easterners had been to all intents and purposes evicted from the Federation and deliberately evicted by a systemic and officially condoned series of massacres, and even if one accepted without the slightest evidence for accepting it, the federal government has always refused Biafra's request for a referendum that the minority tribes within Biafra would wish to remain in the Federation. We are still left with a country which would be among the top 15 of all African countries in numbers, among the top 10 in per capita income, with one of the highest standards of education in the continent, and if all Igbo and Igbo-speaking areas were included, possessing one of the greatest economic potentials. However, as I have said, British policy up to the Nigerian invasion of Biafra, if questionably wise, was not yet criminal, least of all at cabinet level, where the matter had only once been debated. We may never know the extent to which British influence was instrumental in changing General Gowon's mind, from the moment of his first announcement in Lagos that the basis for unity no longer exists, to his acceptance of a confederal solution at Aburi, to his final determination that there should be no solution other than acceptance by Biafra of Lagos domination within the 12-state system. Plainly, however, he did not reach this conclusion merely by contemplating his toenails, and there is every reason to suppose that he received unofficial assurances of British support for any action which might be necessary to protect the unity and territorial integrity of the Nigerian Federation. These assurances, if given, were certainly unofficial to the extent that the British cabinet knew nothing about them, nor did at least a few people in the Commonwealth Office. This early deception of the cabinet makes almost an interesting study as the cabinet's later deception of Parliament. Both will provide material for a book when the papers are available. What this chapter is more interested in demonstrating is how it was one cabinet minister's deception of himself, with all the facts available to him, which led to British complicity in the murder of well over 1 million Africans. At the time of the Nigerian invasion, all the information at the disposal of the cabinet, if not to the Foreign or Commonwealth Office, suggested that the war would be over in a matter of weeks, at which point it seemed that there was no need for the British government to do anything but express public regret for domestic consumption that such a police action should have been necessary. On the information available, to have withheld arms supplies and to have repudiated existing arms contracts would certainly be interpreted as hostile to the recognized government at Lagos, and would also have been singularly pointless, since it could only have prolonged the hostilities while Nigeria sought arms from other sources. Indeed, so effective had been the Lagos High Commissioner in persuading Whitehall that the war would be over in a matter of weeks, that the cabinet allowed itself the moral luxury of refusing to sell General Gowon any military aircraft on the grounds that they would not be needed and would only add to the mess. As a result of this, Chief Enahoro, the Federal Commissioner for Labor and Information, was sent to Moscow, where he successfully negotiated an agreement to receive both MiG fighters and Ilyushin bombers, and the arms race began in earnest. This episode also provided the Foreign Office with a further justification for the Commonwealth Office policy, namely the spectre of a Russian presence in West Africa. Curiously enough, it was this Russian threat argument which later converted Sir Alec Douglas Home, Chief Opposition Spokesman on Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, to the government's policy long after it had emerged as the most atrocious and bloody failure in the country's history. Exactly how the cabinet came to be so misinformed is a matter of permissible speculation. Until the third month of the war, there was a British Deputy High Commissioner in Enugu, the first Biafran capital. He was in a position to inform the British government on the extent of Biafra's preparedness for the war and also on the extent of her will to resist. All the evidence suggests that the Deputy High Commissioner, Mr. James Parker, did in fact fulfill his duty in this respect until the time of his departure after the fall of Enugu. Unfortunately, however, all Mr. Parker's intelligence had to go through the Lagos High Commission, where the new High Commission, who succeeded Sir Francis Comyn Bruce in November 1966, was Sir David Hunt, a very good friend of Nigeria, and a man whose assessment of the military situation was strikingly different from Mr. Parker's. Perhaps we shall never know in what form Mr. Parker's information reached London. What is absolutely certain is that it was Sir David Hunt's assessment which prevailed, which was eagerly welcomed by the mandarins of the Commonwealth Office and which finally reached the cabinet. There need be nothing extraordinary in this, of course. Optimism had been the obsessive characteristics of British overseas policy since the last war, and it was quite normal for high commissioners and ambassadors to associate themselves with the points of view of their host countries, and indeed Sir David had married a niece of one of the richest merchants in Lagos. It was Whitehall's task to reach an objective assessment by balancing reports from all sources. Foreign Office intelligence at this time tended to support Mr. Parker's assessment, and Sir Dennis Greenhill, later permanent Under Secretary, was currently in control of Foreign Office intelligence. Perhaps there was a certain lack of coordination, but nothing can explain why it was that Mr. Thompson, the Secretary for Commonwealth Affairs, continued to accept the advice from the High Commission in Lagos to the exclusion of reports from every other sources, so that he never at any stage in the months which followed believed that the war would last more than a few weeks at the outside, through failure after failure, final push after final push, until the road from Aba to Port Harcourt was strewn with corpses and the town of Ikotekpene was reduced to a vast open-air sarcophagus. Nor did he ever accept that the war was being fought by more than General Ojukwu and a small clique, who imposed their will upon the Biafran populace by a mixture of repression and deliberately misleading propaganda designed to instill the fear of a genocide in them if they surrendered. Nor could he ever bring himself to accept that the authenticated tales of starvation were anything but the fault of General Ojukwu, whose obstinate refusal to accept the Nigerian offer of a land corridor proved that he did not mind how many of his people starved to further his personal ambition. Of course, anybody who had visited Biafra during this time could have told Mr. Thompson that this version was a travesty of the truth, that the Biafran people were very nearly unanimous behind the leadership, that in the prevailing atmosphere of distrust, there was no question of the Biafrans accepting a land corridor unless it was effectively demilitarized, even if the offer was made in good faith, and that if General Ojukwu had ever tried to negotiate terms which did not leave the Biafrans responsible for their own security, the Biafran people would have overthrown him. But this bluff, plumb Scotsman, with a twinkle in his eye and a reassuring manner of speech which made him popular and trusted in the House of Commons, appears to have disbelieved every single report which came out of Biafra in the British and foreign press and from missionary and welfare workers, in preference to what he heard from the High Commission in Lagos. This propensity reached its final absurdity during the emergency debate on August 27, 1968, 13 days after the federal push into Aba and the Igbo heartland had started, when he announced that the final push had not started. On being told that General Gowon had announced the final push on English television the night before, Mr. Thompson had it solemnly announced in Parliament at the close of the debate that this could not be so because he had just heard from Lagos that it was not the case. A week later, Aba fell. Of course, Parliament was well used to this treatment. On 2 occasions, it was denied a vote on the matter, when a government nominee talked the debate out, and on a 3rd occasion, when 173 members had demanded a debate on Biafra. This was diverted, with the collusion of the opposition, into a debate on the entire foreign scene, with many speakers giving their views on the Falkland Islands, on Czechoslovakia, and on the Middle East. The actual deception of Parliament had started much earlier, when on January 25, 1968, Lord Shepherd, a minister of the state in the Commonwealth Office, had solemnly assured the House of Lords that we are neutral to both sides. We certainly are not helping one side or the other. In fact, secret armed flights to Nigeria had been reported in the British press ever since the previous August. Either Lord Shepherd was deliberately misleading the House on this occasion, or he had been misled by his Commonwealth Office advisers. Mr. Thompson himself gave the lie to this finally, when he said in the course of the August 27th debate that neutrality was not a possible option for Her Majesty's government at that time. Mr. Thompson left the Commonwealth Office when it was merged with the Foreign Office in October 1968. At the time of his leaving, no British members of Parliament had yet been able to visit Biafra, at any rate since the war started, and it was only beginning to be made indisputably clear that the direst predictions which anyone had ventured to make about the war's likely cost in human life were wildly optimistic. He let it be known privately that he was much relieved to be rid of the Nigerian imbroglio. Perhaps it was just possible at the time of his handing over responsibility for the war to Mr. Michael Stewart, newly elevated to the title of Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, to believe that all the journalists who had visited Biafra were either incompetent or corrupt, whereas those who remained in London or Lagos and supported the government's policy were better informed and more honest. Similarly, it was just possible to believe at that stage that the figures for death by starvation were widely exaggerated, the product of relief agencies trying to sensationalize their role in collusion with the Biafran authorities, hungry for any propaganda advantage. It was not reasonably possible, however, to believe, as Mr. Thompson claimed to believe, that the main reason for this starvation was General Ojukwu's refusal of a land corridor. This question had already been answered by 2 strongly pro-federal observers, both sent to Nigeria at the government's request. Lord Hunt, the mountaineer, who had conducted an inquiry into relief operations, and Major General H.T. Alexander, one of the first military observers, whose sturdy denial that the Nigerian forces had behaved with the slightest impropriety did much to allay the consciences of those who were not, by nature, much interested in the matter, like Sir Alec Douglas Home. Lord Hunt, in the course of the August debate, said this: What are the facts which have continued for months to block the way to relief operations in Nigeria? The first is the fact of a state of siege. The siege has continued for several months, with the Igbos completely surrounded and cut off by land and water. Brutal and inhuman though it is, the very essence of siege tactics is to reduce the defenders to physical conditions which they can no longer endure. Later, in the same speech, he described General Gowon's dilemma if he were to remove all the obstacles and drop all safeguards in the way of relief aid. He would not only be delaying the attainment of his objective, he has been delaying that for months, but would risk losing it altogether, for time is not on the side of General Gowon. Major General H.T. Alexander expressed the point of view with which he returned from Nigeria most succinctly in a letter which appeared in The Spectator as late as November 29, 1968. One has to understand or try to understand the federal government's point of view, which is that any form of blockade breaking is an act of war, in that it increases the will of the people to resist. Nevertheless, when Mr. Thompson handed over complete responsibility for British policy in Nigeria to Mr. Stewart in October 1968, Stewart had already assumed major responsibility when he took over the Foreign Office in March. It was still possible to say that while the management of British policy had undoubtedly been incompetent, had been tinged with callousness, and had manifested an extraordinary contempt for normal standards of public honesty, it had not yet revealed the full murderousness of its determination to see the matter through, regardless of cost in terms of life and suffering. Mr. Thompson was able to face the long months of unemployment ahead of him in the knowledge that he had not in any significant way impaired his reputation as a genial, down-to-earth fellow with a pleasant Scots accent, and by current government standards remarkably high organizational and administrative ability. Mr. Stewart, as I have said, returned to the Foreign Office in March 1968 with a reputation which had been considerably enhanced by his disappearance from public view in the titular post of First Secretary for Economic Affairs. He was considered a trifle dull, perhaps, not given to wild flights of fancy like his predecessor Mr. George Brown, but certainly trustworthy, in possession of a certain uncompromising personal integrity, and above all balanced. He had never indulged in cabinet intrigues. He had never briefed a political correspondent to the detriment of a cabinet colleague or the Prime Minister. In many ways, he was the perfect antidote to the Prime Minister's public image, steadfast, not by any stretch of the imagination to be described as brilliant, but steady and reliable. On April 13, 1968, Tanzania became the first country to recognize Biafra, soon followed by Gabon, the Ivory Coast, and Zambia. This development was greeted with something like panic in the Foreign Office, whose reaction was to send a briefing to every major embassy in an effort to avoid further diplomatic recognition and assistance to the Biafran cause. The only tangible result of this activity was that on July 31st, France, while not recognizing Biafra as a sovereign state, announced support for Biafran self-determination and called for international action to end the war. All Foreign Office briefing at this time rested heavily upon the legality of the Nigerian government. See Chapter 4. The dangers of giving gravely irresponsible encouragement to other secessionist movements in Africa, and above all, on the hopelessness of Biafra's situation from the military point of view. There could be no question but that Biafra would be defeated within very short time. Any encouragement of the rebellion could only prolong Biafra's agony. To this was added information about Russia's growing commercial and diplomatic stake in Lagos, with the suggestion that if Britain were to discontinue its supply of arms, the whole of Nigeria would automatically fall within the Russian sphere of influence. This would not only prevent Western access to Nigeria's vital oil deposits, but would also endanger Europe's access to the East by the Cape routes in some hypothetical strategic situation of the future. This last argument, accepted uncritically by such uninquiring people as Sir Alec Douglas Home, and also, I have been told, by the Australian government, resulted in Britain and Russia competing with each other in their support for the war against Biafra, with total disregard for the damage which this might do to the country they were claiming to support, and cynical indifference to the enormity of the crime which was being committed against the Biafrans. Approaches were also made to the Tanzanian and Zambian governments, requesting them to use their influence with the Biafrans to accept the terms being offered by the Nigerians. These terms were essentially that Biafra should renounce secession, accept division into 3 states along the lines dictated by General Gowon, and in this form return to membership of the Nigerian Federation on equal terms with the other states, except that Nigerian army garrisons would be posted at various places within the East Central states, comprising most of the Igbo heartland. Anybody who has read the report of the Mensa inquiry into allegation of genocide will understand why the Biafrans could never accept the Nigerian army and why these terms amounted to no more and no less than an admission that further resistance was impossible. All this diplomatic activity in Mr. Stewart's mind and in the minds of those responsible for formulating British policy came under the heading of peace initiatives, and it is most important to understand what the British government meant by peace in the context of the Nigerian Biafran War. Peace meant the restoration of a united Nigeria, whether this was brought about by a change of heart among the Biafran people or whether it was brought about by their defeat. In this sense, and in this sense alone, British influence was invariably exerted to secure peace in Nigerian Biafra. When one heard a politician or a representative of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office discussing Britain's influence, it was most important to bear this definition in mind, because otherwise one was likely to suspect such spokesmen of lying, as well as of supporting a policy whose effect was known to be genocidal. Britain's influence in Lagos had not been negligible, as a few critics of government policy have claimed. Such people imagined that our influence was being used to restrain the genocidal inclinations of Nigerian troops and to urge on the federal authorities to some compromise solution for peace. If that had indeed been our intention, then plainly our influence was negligible, and the repeated claim by government spokesmen that discontinuation of arms supply would mitigate our influence was as farcical as most people supposed it to be, although it succeeded in convincing Mr. Michael Foot, the doyen of left-wingers and keeper of the left's conscience. It is true that British request led to the acceptance of the International Observer Team and also to Dr. Arikpo's alleged offer of a land corridor for relief, both of which are discussed in Chapter 6. But the plain truth of the matter, as it now emerges, is that Britain was only consigned to prevent genocide to the extent that knowledge of such activity would frustrate the successful fulfillment of our policy, peace within the Nigerian Federation. It was far more important and far easier to suppress or confuse the world's knowledge of genocide, and no compromise solution was acceptable to the British government. The fact that Britain had no influence in preventing atrocities could not have been better illustrated than when Mr. Wilson flew out to Lagos in March 1969, after Wilson's Churchill's report of civilian bombing had appeared in the Times. The same report had been appearing under last August's bylanes for over 12 months, and the government had known what was going on for at least as long as that. However, Mr. Wilson was able to come away with a verbal assurance that any such civilian bombing had been entirely accidental, but that bombing would nevertheless continue, and on the strength of that, he reaffirmed his support for the cause of Nigerian unity, which had already, according to every source available to him, cost a million civilian lives. Britain's influence continued to be directed towards bringing Nigeria's war against Biafra to a successful conclusion. It is commonplace to blame Mr. Wilson for all the disaster of his government, and to the extent that a prime minister is theoretically responsible for everything that occurs within his administration. Mr. Wilson is undoubtedly responsible for Britain's complicity in the mass murder of an African people. But if there is a single man in Britain who bears greater responsibility, not, it is true, for the original formulation of British policy, but for its obstinate inflexibility, then that man is Mr. Michael Stewart. I have described the reputation he enjoyed at the time of his return to the Foreign Office in March 1968. This reputation stayed with him until the extraordinary episode of Anguilla finally shook public confidence, and more importantly, the confidence of his colleagues in the cabinet. On that occasion, it will be remembered, Mr. Stewart justified the armed invasion of a small Caribbean island by saying that Britain was responsible for its external security, and that this obligation could no longer be fulfilled because the island had been taken over by the mafia, and that undoubted cases of murder and arson were rife. Later, under questioning, he admitted that there had only been 2 cases of arson on Anguilla in the past 2 years, no cases of murder, and only one suspected case of manslaughter, still unproven, committed a year before. As for the mafia, he produced no evidence that it had ever set foot on Anguilla, although he deported and renounced undesirable 3 American businessmen who, it was said, had been hoping to secure hotel concessions from the president. Luckily for him, nobody was killed in the invasion, even if his reputation for steady, unimaginative reliability was never quite the same afterwards. But this did not happen until March 1969, and by then the entire government was irretrievably committed in Nigeria. To have admitted that it had made a dreadful mistake would have been to admit complicity in the murder of rather more than 1 million civilians. 3 months after his return to the Foreign Office, Mr. Stewart spoke in an adjournment debate on the supply of arms to Nigeria. This was the assurance he gave on June 12, 1968. If we make the supposition that it were the intention of the federal government not merely to preserve the unity of Nigeria, but to proceed without mercy, either with the slaughter or the starvation of the Igbo people, or if we were to take the supposition that it were the intention of the federal government to take advantage of a military situation in order to throw aside with contempt of any terms of reasonable settlement, then the argument which justified the policy we have so far pursued would fall, and we would have to reconsider, and more than reconsider, the action we have so far taken. On July 14, 1968, a month later, the Red Cross estimated that 3,000 people, mostly children and old people, were dying daily from protein deficiency. Mr. Stewart continued to supply arms to Nigeria. On August 3rd, the Red Cross announced that 6,000 daily were dying. An airstrip at Obilago, built by the Biafrans and handed over to the Red Cross for the exclusive use of relief flights into Biafra, had been bombed within hours of being handed over. Mr. Stewart continued to supply arms to Nigeria, continued his diplomatic pressure in Nigeria's support, and continued to urge General Gowon to bring his war to a successful conclusion. In December 1968, a medical survey of the International Red Cross estimated that current mortality was 10,000 a day in unoccupied Biafra, 4,000 a day in those parts of Biafra under federal occupation. This announcement resulted in a dramatic increase in the relief into Biafra, and also a marked decrease in federal obstructionism to relief work inside the federally occupied areas. But it did not result in Mr. Stewart reconsidering his policy. On February 16, 1969, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, a former president of Nigeria, produced his peace proposals, whereby Biafra's fate would be decided by a plebiscite among the minority tribes in Biafra. A large part of Nigeria's case had always rested upon the assertion that these minority tribes were almost unanimous in their desire to remain within the Federation. But Dr. Azikiwe's proposals were rejected out of hand by Nigeria on the grounds that any such plebiscite would be an infringement of national sovereignty, and the Biafrans were in no position to make such a demand. Mr. Stewart, far from reconsidering his policy, took it upon himself to reiterate it with increasing vehemence throughout the following months. I have said it very often that this is Her Majesty's government's policy, that we do believe that the unity of Nigeria should be maintained. We must understand that a solution to this problem must rest on the position of one, not two Nigerias.